winding up another successful model year. And we at Chrysler couldn't be happier about the way the public has gone after our 65s. In fact, 1965 sales have set a new corporation record. And why not? We have great cars, and our salesmen have really put them across. We're sure they'll even do better in 66. As master technicians, our part of the 1965 story still has a long way to go. 2, 3, or even 4 years from now, our 65 customers will be coming back to us for the best in service. So it's up to us to take good care of these 65 models. And to make our job easier, we have to keep up to date on all the service procedures, design changes, and modifications. Well, with that in mind, let's sashay over where Pete and Gene are talking and do a little brain picking. Now, howdy, gents. What's the good word?
Well, hi, Tech. Gene and I were just kicking around some of the latest service bulletins.
Glad to see you're keeping well informed. How about passing on some of your tips to all the technicians?
Always happy to oblige, Tech, but I think I'll let Gene hit some of the torque flight changes first. Okay, Gene?
Right, Pete. We've had a few important running changes. One mid-year change in the A727B torque flight smooths out the shift from neutral to drive. It's a new rear clutch assembly that cushions the clutch application. A wave spring and a spacer were added between the Belleville washer and the clutch pack to provide a more gradual application of the clutch. There's also a new clutch retainer, clutch discs, and pressure plate. With these new parts, the clutch pack clearance has been increased to between 37 and 60 thousandths of an inch. Another mid-year improvement was a new rear annulus gear support and the addition of a hardened thrust plate. The thrust plate is splined to the output shaft between the annulus support and the reverse planet pinion carrier. With a new annulus support and thrust plate, the rear planetary set runs a lot smoother and quieter.
Speaking of clutches, I'd like to talk about some of the reported clutch failures that turned out to be caused by something entirely different. For instance, an incorrectly adjusted throttle linkage or low oil level can cause low throttle pressure, which in turn will result in a delayed or slowed clutch application.
You can get the same condition if the gear shift control cable to the manual valve is not correctly adjusted.
You sure can, Gene. And either way, it means eventual clutch burning.
By the way, Gene, did you ever find out what causes that noise when a torque flight job's backing up?
I sure did, Pete. Here's the story. When the transmission is cold, the oil level is slightly lower than normal, so there is some aeration in the oil. When the bubbles reach the outlet portion of the pump, the outer pump rotor is forced away from the pump housing momentarily. The noise is created by the rotor oscillating in the housing. The oscillation doesn't harm the transmission in any way, so since it happens only in reverse and only when the transmission is cold, it's simply a matter of explaining the noise to the customer.
That's real important, Gene. Once you convince the owner that the noise won't hurt anything, he'll probably ignore it from then on. What's next?
Well, I'd like to talk about variable speed wipers on Furies, Polaras, Chryslers, and Imperials. One of the problems on some early production cars was loss of the shunt circuit ground at the wiper switch. Now, without a shunt circuit, the wiper motor overspeeds. And worse than that, you can burn out the motor. So, don't make the mistake of just changing a burned-out motor. Check out the switch and wiring to find out what caused it.
There's a good explanation of why the motor burns out in the reference book. Now, how about that switch checkout, Pete?
The switch problem has been corrected in production. A new switch with a longer grounding tab riveted to the switch case provides a more solid ground. To check the switch circuit, disconnect the motor connector and hook a jumper between the blue and black switch leads. Run a test light between the red and yellow switch leads, and then turn the ignition switch to accessory with the wiper switch off. If the test lamp lights, the wiper switch and wiring to the connector are all right. If the switch checks out okay, ground either the red or yellow motor lead and connect a test light between the other lead and the positive battery terminal. If the lamp doesn't light, there's an open in the motor shunt circuit.
Before you replace the motor, though, use a test light or an O-meter to check the connector and the wires to the motor.
Right, Tech. Another wiper problem on Furies, Polaras, and Chryslers is caused by incorrect installation of the wiper arms on the pivots. There's a special tool for removing and installing the arms. Tool number C3982 releases the spring tension that holds the arm on the pivot. Now, if you try to use any other tool, you're liable to distort the retaining clip and ruin the arm. Examine the serrations on the pivot and inside the socket of the arm for distortion. Also, make sure the arm retaining clip is not bent or loose.
Here's another tip on wiper service. When you're putting a blade on the arm, it's possible to get it on too far. To avoid this, push the blade on the arm until you hear it snap into place. Don't press the blade release during installation.
Since we've moved toward the front of the car, let me introduce a new feature in the engine compartment. It's a brand new idea in oil filters. The filter has a replaceable element as before, but the container is entirely new. It consists of a metal can and a screw-on cap.
The cap is supposed to be tightened by hand only. If you use a wrench, you're liable to ruin the cap or the can. Tell him about it, Gene.
Right, Tech. There's an O-ring type seal in the cap of the container. When the cap is turned down, the seal compresses against the side of the can. If the cap is screwed on too far, the seal will be ruined by the threads on the can. Just in case you have big muscles, there's a stop built into the cap and can. When the cap is screwed on the right distance, a hole at the end of the cap threads stops against a bump in the side of the can. If you used a wrench to tighten the cap, you could force it past the stop, ruining the seal and possibly also ruining the cap and can.
Maybe you ought to explain why there's a hex head on the can.
All right, Tech. Sometimes after a car has been driven 2,000 or 3,000 miles, the combination of dirt and heat will make the cap hard to remove. That's the only time a wrench should ever touch that cap.
Anything new on steering, Pete?
Well, here's a recent change at the steering gear coupling, Tech. It's a new method of anchoring the coupling to the steering gear worm shaft. The lock bolt retainer has been replaced by a steel roll pin. The new coupling is interchangeable with the one that uses the lock bolt. Now, if it's necessary to disconnect the steering shaft coupling from the worm shaft, always use a new roll pin when they're being reassembled.
Here's another tip, Pete. On the first type coupling with a lock bolt, be careful when you're tightening the bolt. The correct torque is 200 inch-pounds. If you go over that amount, you might twist the head off the bolt. Now, if someone will please turn the record, we'll get on with some more 65 service tips. Pete, you have quite a reputation for being able to track down wind noises. How about passing along some tips to all the other technicians?
I'll be glad to, Tech. You can't always tell just where a noise originates. You might start tracing a whistle in one area and wind up finding it in a spot that seems to be totally unrelated. Another thing that makes wind noise diagnosis tough is the fact that the noise will probably change according to operating conditions. Now, for instance, wind speed and direction can have a strong influence on the noise. And as little as 5 miles an hour difference in car speed might bring in the noise or eliminate it. Noise locations may also vary from one car to another, even when the two cars are identical in model and body style. So there's no doubt about it, wind noises can give a technician a real bad time. We've adopted a few procedures that take some of the uncertainties and frustrations out of wind noise tracing. The basic operation, and still the most important step, is a thorough road test. However, before road testing, check the alignment of all the doors and windows. In many cases, adjustment of a door or window will eliminate the source of the noise. This is especially true on hardtops.
On hardtops, be sure the windows seal properly against the roof rail weather strip. Also, check the seal between the front and rear windows. You'll find procedures for making any necessary adjustments in previous reference books and your service manuals.
Right, Tech. And don't forget that the roof rail weather strip retainer is also adjustable in and out. The attaching screw holes are slotted to allow for some movement. If there are any loose moldings, tighten them. Cover any protrusions or openings in the moldings with tape during the test. Seal around the outside of the windshield reveal moldings before road testing. Press rope-type sealer into the opening and smooth it off with a trim stick.
Another spot that might need some of that rope-type sealer is the drip rail. Take a close look at the seams and see that they're sealed up.
Thanks, Tech. Most of the wind noise complaints center around the vent wing area, and they can be pretty tough to pinpoint. Now, here's how we do it. Seal the vent wing and cover the opening between the front of the door and the windshield pillar with masking tape. Then drive the car to see if the noise has been eliminated.
I notice you overlap short sections of tape to seal the openings, Pete.
Right, Tech. That's so we can remove it a little bit at a time while the car is moving. If there's no noise with the tape applied, you can be pretty sure you've located the general area of the air leak. To pin down the exact location, maintain the car speed at which the noise originally occurred. Open the window, peel the tape from the door opening and windshield pillar one section at a time, and close the window. If the noise comes in, mark the spot and reseal the opening. Then, pull the tape from the vent wing to see if there's an air leak there, too. If there is, you'll probably hear a high-pitched whistle. A noise that comes in when the tape is removed from the front of the door opening is probably the result of poor weather strip contact. The weather strip may be distorted or torn loose. Check the weather strip contact by closing the door on a shipping tag. Pull the tag out of the door and note whether the weather strip is gripping the tag. Distorted or torn weather strip should be replaced if it doesn't provide good sealing contact. Sometimes you can improve weather strip contact by inserting a closed-cell foamed plastic shim under the weather strip. Another method is moving the weather strip outward slightly.
Be sure to read the reference book for this session. You'll find some dope on noises that can be mighty tough to trace. There's one in the fresh air plenum chamber, and even the door hinges get into the act. Any other good tips on body service?
We had to replace some tailgate windows on some of our station wagons before we found out what was chipping the glass. As you know, that's a tempered glass, so if it gets chipped or scratched, it will eventually break altogether. We found that the glass was hitting one of the weather strip retaining screws when the window went closed. The screw wasn't installed straight, so the weather strip didn't provide enough clearance. We haven't had the problem lately, but we still inspect all the weather strip retaining screws.
There's been a change in that weather strip, and the new retaining screws have thinner heads, so the clearance has been increased.
Thanks, Tech. I have a couple of items on air conditioning I'd like to talk about if we have time.
For you, Gene, we'll take time. Carry on.
On some of the cars with a reheat-type air conditioner, condensation caused a severe window fogging problem when the defroster was turned on. Early in the spring, when the days were hot and the nights were cool, people used air conditioning during the day and heaters when it cooled off at night. The condensation from the air conditioner was blown out through the heater and defroster outlets. That misted up the windows real quickly. Another condensation problem comes from operating the air conditioner with the independent side vents open, especially in humid weather. This one is easy to spot, though, because the customer will usually complain that he isn't getting enough performance from the air conditioner. Of course, the most obvious reason for condensation discharge is an accumulation of water in the drain pan, so make sure the drain tubes are not plugged with dirt or sealer. To avoid the window fogging, we advised our customers to run the air conditioner for about a minute before turning the heater or defroster on. That blows the moisture out of the system.
Let me interrupt here, Gene. I've heard some reports of independent air conditioning specialists substituting refrigerant 22 for refrigerant 12 when they recharge a system. Don't ever do it. Don't even use a partial charge of refrigerant 22 in our systems. You'll wind up with head pressures as high as a kite, and the mixture of the two refrigerants will ruin the seals and corrode the lines. Our air conditioners are designed to use only refrigerant 12. If you use anything but refrigerant 12, you're just asking for trouble.
Okay, Tech. We'll sure stick to refrigerant 12.
What's on the schedule for the next session, Tech? It's about time for the new models, isn't it?
Right you are, Pete. And the way things look right now, we'll have a lot of new features to talk about. But like you said, that's next month's story. Be sure to be on hand.